Sit down and stop wasting my time with these sob stories. PTSD isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, young man." Those were the cutting words. Judge Patricia Hartwell spat across room 204 at Riverside County Superior Court, her gavel poised like a weapon above her bench. The veteran standing before her, Marcus Thompson, had just tried to explain why a police siren during a routine traffic stop had triggered a flashback so severe he'd collapsed on the sidewalk, shaking uncontrollably as memories of an IED explosion in Helmand Province crashed over him like a tidal wave. The courtroom fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Marcus stood rigid at the defense table, his jaw clenched tight, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to respond to the disrespect. His public defender, Sarah Mitchell, looked stunned by the judge's callousness. The prosecutor, David Chen, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Even the court clerk, Mrs. Barbara Collins, glanced up from her typing with barely concealed shock. But what Judge Hartwell didn't know was that outside those oak-paneled walls, word was already spreading through the tight-knit veteran community. Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan had been sitting in the gallery, watching his former Marine crumble under judicial ridicule. His phone was already buzzing with messages to the local Marine Corps League, the VFW Post 847, and every veteran group within a 50-mile radius. What happened next would shake the very foundations of that courthouse and remind everyone present that some bonds can never be broken, and some respect must never be forgotten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Riverside, California. The late November air carried a crisp chill that seemed to seep through the concrete and glass of the county courthouse, imposing structure that stood like a monument to justice on the corner of Main Street and Court Avenue. Its neoclassical columns and marble steps had witnessed decades of human drama, but few cases would prove as pivotal as the one about to unfold in room 204. Marcus Thompson had barely slept the night before. In his small studio apartment downtown, he'd paced the hardwood floors until nearly 3 in the morning, his mind racing between the approaching court date and the ghosts that never seemed to leave him alone. The nightmares had been particularly vivid lately, filled with the faces of Private First Class Danny Morrison and Lance Corporal Alex Chen, the 2 Marines who died in the blast that should have taken him instead. Their deaths haunted him every day, but lately, the guilt felt heavier, more suffocating. He'd served 3 tours with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, spending most of his deployment in Afghanistan's volatile Helmand Province. Marcus had been a good Marine, the kind of NCO who looked after his men and led from the front. His squad respected him, trusted him with their lives. But on that scorching afternoon in July 2019, when their convoy hit that pressure plate IED buried in the dusty road outside Marja, everything changed. The explosion had been devastating. Marcus remembered the initial flash, brighter than the desert sun, followed by a concussive wave that lifted their armored vehicle 3 feet off the ground. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in his ears subsided enough to think, he'd found himself thrown clear of the wreckage, bloodied but breathing. Morrison and Chen hadn't been so fortunate. Marcus had crawled through the debris, calling their names, but found only silence and the metallic smell of blood mixed with cordite that would forever trigger his panic attacks. He'd completed his tour, received an honorable discharge, and come home to California with a chest full of ribbons and a head full of demons. The Department of Veterans Affairs had diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, but the clinical term felt inadequate to describe the way his nervous system had been rewired by war. Loud noises made him dive for cover, crowds made him scan for threats, and sirens, especially police sirens, transported him instantly back to that road outside Marja where his friends had died. Which is exactly what had happened 3 weeks ago, during what should have been a routine traffic stop on University Avenue. Officer Kevin Martinez had pulled Marcus over for a broken taillight, a simple fix-it ticket that should have taken 5 minutes. But when backup arrived with sirens wailing, Marcus's mind had short-circuited. The sound triggered such a severe flashback that he'd collapsed on the sidewalk, hyperventilating and shaking as his body relived the trauma of that Afghan roadside. The responding officers, unfamiliar with PTSD symptoms, had interpreted his behavior as resisting arrest or being under the influence. Despite Marcus's attempts to explain his condition, despite the VA identification card in his wallet clearly marking him as a disabled veteran, he'd been arrested and charged with disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The charges carried potential jail time, a prospect that terrified Marcus almost as much as his flashbacks. Now he stood in room 204, wearing his best and only suit, a navy blue ensemble his sister Lisa had bought him for job interviews. The fabric felt constricting around his shoulders, too formal for someone who'd grown accustomed to worn jeans and faded t-shirts. His hair was freshly cut, his beard trimmed, and he'd even polished his old dress shoes until they gleamed. He wanted to look respectable, to show the court he wasn't some vagrant or troublemaker, but a veteran who deserved understanding and compassion. Judge Patricia Hartwell had other ideas. A career jurist in her late 50s, she'd built her reputation on efficiency and no-nonsense sentencing. She prided herself on running a tight courtroom where sob stories and excuses fell on deaf ears. With graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and reading glasses that seemed permanently perched on the end of her nose, she commanded respect through intimidation rather than wisdom. Hartwell had little patience for what she considered the modern trend of using mental health as an excuse for poor behavior. In her worldview, people were responsible for their actions regardless of their circumstances. She'd seen too many defendants claim depression, anxiety, or trauma to justify everything from shoplifting to assault. To her, PTSD was just another manipulation tactic, especially among young men who wanted to play the hero card. The prosecutor, David Chen, was a competent but uninspired career attorney who handled dozens of misdemeanor cases each week. He'd reviewed Marcus's file perfunctorily, noting the VA documentation and psychiatric evaluations, but his caseload was too heavy to invest much time in understanding the nuances of combat trauma. To him, this was a straightforward case of disorderly conduct with some mental health complications that might warrant a lenient sentence. Sarah Mitchell, Marcus's court-appointed public defender, was overworked and underpaid, handling more cases than any attorney should reasonably manage. She'd graduated from law school with idealistic dreams of fighting for justice, but 5 years of plea bargains and packed courtrooms had worn down her enthusiasm. She'd read Marcus's file, interviewed him briefly, and prepared a standard mitigation argument based on his military service and medical condition. As the hearing began, the gallery was sparsely populated. A few family members of other defendants waited their turn, along with a handful of courthouse regulars who attended proceedings out of boredom or civic curiosity. But in the third row, Staff Sergeant Mike Sullivan sat quietly, his weathered hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving Marcus. Sullivan had served alongside Marcus in Afghanistan, leading a different squad in the same battalion. He'd been there when the IED exploded, had helped pull survivors from the wreckage, and had carried Morrison's body to the medevac helicopter. He knew better than anyone what Marcus had endured, how the weight of command and survivor's guilt could crush even the strongest Marine. When Sullivan heard about Marcus's arrest through the veteran grapevine, he'd made it his mission to attend the hearing. He'd taken a day off from his job at the VA Medical Center, where he worked as a counselor, helping other veterans navigate their own battles with trauma. He'd seen too many good Marines fall through the cracks of an indifferent system, and he wasn't about to let it happen to Marcus. The hearing began routinely enough. The court clerk called the case, and both attorneys approached the bench for a brief sidebar discussion. Judge Hartwell reviewed the file with visible impatience, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she flipped through pages of medical documentation and police reports. David Chen presented the state's case efficiently, describing the events of the traffic stop and Marcus's subsequent behavior. He cited witness statements from the responding officers, emphasizing the disruption caused by Marcus's actions and the resources required to manage the situation. His presentation was clinical and detached, reducing Marcus's trauma response to a list of violations and inconveniences. Sarah Mitchell rose to present the defense, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd made similar arguments countless times before. She outlined Marcus's military service, his 3 combat deployments, and his documented PTSD diagnosis. She explained the neurological basis of trauma responses, how triggers could overwhelm the nervous system and cause involuntary reactions that looked like resistance or intoxication to untrained observers. Judge Hartwell listened with obvious skepticism, her expression growing more disdainful with each medical term and psychiatric explanation. When Mitchell finished her presentation, the judge leaned back in her chair and fixed Marcus with a withering stare. That's when she delivered the words that would change everything. "Sit down and stop wasting my time with these sob stories. PTSD isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card, young man." Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows, each syllable a fresh wound to his already battered sense of self-worth. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the court reporter seemed to pause mid-keystroke, stunned by the judge's callousness. Sarah Mitchell's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, searching for words to respond to such blatant disrespect for her client's service and sacrifice. Marcus stood frozen at the defense table, his mind reeling between past and present. The judge's dismissive tone reminded him of every bureaucrat who'd minimized his struggles, every VA employee who'd treated his condition like a paperwork problem, every civilian who'd thanked him for his service while secretly doubting the reality of his wounds. His hands began to tremble slightly, the first sign of an approaching panic attack. His vision started to tunnel, and the familiar taste of copper filled his mouth. The courtroom seemed to fade around the edges, as his nervous system prepared for fight or flight, the same response that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, but now marked him as unstable in civilian society. Judge Hartwell continued her tirade, her voice rising with each word. "I've seen dozens of cases like this, young man. Veterans who think their service entitles them to special treatment, who use their military experience as an excuse for every poor decision and moment of weakness. Well, not in my courtroom. Here, everyone is held to the same standard of behavior and accountability." In the gallery, Staff Sergeant Sullivan's jaw clenched with barely controlled rage. His phone was already in his hand, fingers flying across the screen as he sent urgent messages to his contacts throughout the veteran community. The first text went to the Marine Corps League Chapter President. "Emergency at courthouse. Judge mocking Marines' PTSD. Need all hands now." The next message went to Tony Ramirez, a corporal who'd served with Marcus and now worked at Camp Pendleton. "Judge disrespecting our brother. Room 204. Riverside Courthouse. Spread the word." Within minutes, the network was activated. Phones buzzed in VFW halls, American Legion posts, and veteran support groups across Southern California. Jake Anderson was installing drywall in a Temecula subdivision when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but the voice was unmistakably military. "Anderson, this is Sullivan. Remember Marcus Thompson from our deployment? He's getting railroaded by some judge in Riverside. We're mobilizing. Can you make it?" Jake looked at his tools, then at his phone. "Give me the address. I'm on my way." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maria Santos was in her Marine Corps uniform, preparing for a ceremony at March Air Reserve Base, when the call came through. As one of the few active duty Marines in the network, her presence would carry extra weight. She spoke briefly with her commanding officer, explaining the situation in terms that any military leader would understand. "Permission to support a fellow Marine, sir." The CO nodded. "Go, and take anyone else who wants to volunteer." Robert Tank Williams was at his physical therapy appointment when his phone started buzzing with messages. A double amputee who'd lost both legs to an IED in the same province where Marcus had served. Tank understood better than most the invisible wounds that accompanied visible ones. He'd been fighting his own battles with the VA system, struggling to get proper care for his PTSD while dealing with the challenges of life in a wheelchair. Tank's wife, Jennifer, didn't hesitate when he explained the situation. She helped him into their modified van and started driving toward Riverside, knowing that this wasn't just about Marcus Thompson, but about every veteran who'd been dismissed, ignored, or treated as less than human by a system that should have been supporting them. Dr. Amanda Foster, Marcus's VA counselor, was between patient appointments when Sullivan's call reached her. She'd been working with Marcus for over a year, watching him slowly rebuild his sense of self-worth after the devastating losses in Afghanistan. She knew how hard he'd fought to stabilize his condition, how seriously he took his treatment, and how much courage it required for him to face each day. As a mental health professional, Dr. Foster couldn't officially advocate for her patient in a legal proceeding, but as a human being who'd witnessed Marcus's struggle, she felt compelled to act. She called in a favor with a colleague to cover her remaining appointments and headed for her car. Back in the courtroom, Judge Hartwell was reaching the crescendo of her lecture. "I don't care what happened to you overseas, Mr. Thompson. I don't care about your nightmares or your anxiety or whatever else you claim to be suffering from. What I care about is maintaining order in this community and ensuring that people face consequences for their actions. Mental illness is not a license to disrupt public order." Marcus felt something break inside him, a final thread of hope that had been holding him together. The woman in the black robe, the person supposedly representing justice and fairness, had just invalidated everything he'd endured in service to his country. She'd dismissed not just his condition, but the sacrifices of everyone who'd worn the uniform and come home carrying invisible wounds. Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice, rising from her chair with more conviction than she'd shown in months. "Your Honor, with all due respect, my client's condition is well documented by medical professionals. The Veterans Administration has classified him as 100% disabled due to combat-related PTSD. His reaction during the traffic stop was an involuntary neurological response to auditory triggers, not a willful act of defiance." Judge Hartwell waved her hand dismissively. "Spare me the medical jargon, counselor. I've heard it all before. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, bipolar disorder, every alphabet soup diagnosis designed to excuse personal responsibility. Mr. Thompson made choices that night, and those choices had consequences. My job is to ensure he faces those consequences, not to enable his excuses." The prosecutor, David Chen, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. While he'd built his case around Marcus's actions that night, he hadn't expected such vehement hostility from the bench. As an attorney, he understood the importance of considering mitigating factors in sentencing, and Marcus's military service and documented medical condition clearly qualified. Outside the courthouse, cars were converging from multiple directions. The first to arrive was Tony Ramirez, who'd made the drive from Camp Pendleton in record time. He was still in his utility uniform, having left his duties to answer Sullivan's call. Behind him came Jake Anderson, his work boots still dusty from the construction site, his face grim with determination. Maria Santos arrived with 3 other active-duty Marines from March Air Reserve Base, their dress blue uniforms gleaming in the late morning sun. Tank Williams was helped from his van by his wife and another veteran, his wheelchair decorated with Marine Corps emblems and combat patches that told their own story of sacrifice. One by one, they gathered on the courthouse steps, a growing assembly of men and women who'd answered the call to support a fellow Marine. Some wore uniforms, others civilian clothes, but all carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of those who'd served. They came from different units, different eras, different backgrounds, but they were united by shared values and an unbreakable bond. As word continued to spread through social media and veteran networks, more arrived. Captain Stephen Blake, a Marine Corps representative from the regional headquarters, had been alerted by his staff and decided to attend personally. Jennifer Hayes, a reporter from the local news station and daughter of a Vietnam veteran, had picked up the story from her police scanner and was setting up her camera crew. The crowd was growing larger by the minute, but it remained disciplined and respectful. These weren't protesters or activists. They were veterans who understood the importance of order and proper procedure. They formed loose ranks on the courthouse steps, waiting for a signal from Sullivan, who was still inside monitoring the hearing. Inside room 204, Judge Hartwell was approaching her conclusion. "Mr. Thompson, I'm prepared to sentence you to 90 days in county jail, suspended upon completion of community service and anger management classes. You'll also pay restitution for the police resources wasted during your episode, plus court costs and fees." Marcus felt the world spinning around him. 90 days in jail, even suspended, would appear on background checks and destroy any chance he had of finding stable employment. The community service and classes would mark him as a criminal in the system's eyes, not a veteran struggling with service-connected disabilities. He thought about Morrison and Chen, about the promises he'd made to their families, about the future he'd envisioned where he could honor their memory through productive civilian life. All of it seemed to be crumbling under the weight of a judge's prejudice and ignorance. Sullivan's phone was buzzing constantly now, as more veterans reported their arrival at the courthouse. He estimated at least 40 Marines had assembled outside, with more on the way. He sent a final message to the group chat, "Moving in on my signal. Maintain discipline and bearing. We're here to show respect, not cause trouble." Standing slowly from his seat in the gallery, Sullivan made his way toward the courtroom doors. What happened next would either save Marcus Thompson or destroy them all, but Sullivan knew one thing with absolute certainty. No Marine would face this humiliation alone. Not on his watch. Not ever. The double doors of room 204 remained closed, but behind them, Staff Sergeant Sullivan could feel the weight of brotherhood gathering. His phone displayed a constant stream of confirmations from Marines converging on the courthouse from across Southern California. What had started as an emergency call to a few trusted comrades had evolved into something unprecedented in the veteran community. Outside, the November air carried the sound of boots on marble as more service members climbed the courthouse steps. Each arrival was greeted with silent nods of recognition, the kind of wordless communication that develops between warriors who've shared foxholes and firefights. They came from construction sites and corporate offices, from college campuses and unemployment lines, from rehabilitation centers and family gatherings. The common thread binding them all was the understanding that when one Marine was under attack, they all were. Captain Stephen Blake adjusted his dress blue uniform as he surveyed the growing assembly. As the Regional Marine Corps representative, his presence lent official weight to what could have been dismissed as an impromptu gathering. He'd received the initial alert through proper channels, but the decision to attend personally came from something deeper than military protocol. Blake had served 2 tours in Iraq and understood how easily the transition to civilian life could go sideways, especially when the very institutions meant to protect veterans instead treated them as problems to be managed. The crowd now numbered close to 50, a mix of active-duty Marines, reservists, and veterans, spanning multiple generations of service. Among them stood Master Sergeant Patricia Valdez, a combat veteran whose own struggles with PTSD had led her to become an advocate for military mental health. She'd driven down from Los Angeles after receiving word through the Veteran Women's Network, knowing that Marcus's experience reflected challenges faced by countless others who'd served. Beside her, Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres checked his watch and scanned the faces around him. Torres ran a nonprofit organization that helped veterans navigate bureaucracy and access services, and he'd encountered too many cases where institutional ignorance had destroyed lives that combat couldn't claim. His organization maintained a legal fund specifically for situations like this, and he was already planning how to mobilize resources if the hearing went badly. The courthouse security guards watched nervously from their stations as the crowd continued to grow. These weren't typical protesters or demonstrators. Their bearing and discipline were unmistakably military. They formed orderly groups without anyone giving explicit commands, maintained respectful conversation levels, and showed no signs of aggression or hostility. Still, the sheer number of people gathering around a single court case was unusual enough to make security personnel alert their supervisors. Inside the courthouse lobby, Dr. Amanda Foster approached the information desk to inquire about courtroom locations. She'd made the drive from the VA Medical Center in record time, her professional obligation to maintain therapeutic boundaries warring with her human desire to support a patient who'd worked so hard to rebuild his life. As Marcus's counselor, she'd witnessed his gradual progress from the broken Marine, who'd first entered her office, to someone capable of holding down part-time employment and maintaining stable relationships. Foster understood better than most how devastating Judge Hartwell's words would be to Marcus's fragile sense of self-worth. Months of therapy could be undone by institutional rejection, especially from a figure representing authority and justice. She'd seen strong Marines crumble under less direct attacks on their dignity, and she knew that Marcus's survival might depend on seeing evidence that not everyone in the system had abandoned him. The elevator carried her to the second floor, where she could already sense tension in the air. Courthouse personnel moved with the heightened awareness that develops when routine proceedings take unexpected turns. Through the reinforced glass windows, she could see the crowd gathering outside, their organized presence a stark contrast to the usual chaos of foot traffic and random passers-by. Jennifer Hayes adjusted her camera angle to capture the full scope of the assembly on the courthouse steps. As a television reporter, she'd covered hundreds of stories, but this felt different. Her father had served in Vietnam and come home to a society that treated veterans as pariahs rather than heroes. She'd grown up hearing stories about the institutional indifference that had cost him jobs, relationships, and nearly his life during the darkest periods of his readjustment. The story developing here represented more than one veteran's legal troubles. It symbolized the ongoing struggle between those who'd served and a civilian system that often failed to understand their sacrifices. Her news director had initially been skeptical about covering a routine misdemeanor hearing, but the visual impact of 50 uniformed Marines gathering in support of a fellow veteran made for compelling television. Hayes approached several Marines for brief interviews, finding them articulate and passionate, but careful not to prejudice ongoing legal proceedings. Their consistent message centered on respect, brotherhood, and the obligation to support fellow service members facing institutional challenges. None criticized the legal system directly, but their presence spoke louder than any words about their perception of justice being denied. Back in room 204, Marcus struggled to maintain composure as Judge Hartwell continued her lecture about personal responsibility and the consequences of poor choices. Each word felt like a physical blow, stripping away layers of healing he'd built through months of therapy and medication management. The courtroom's fluorescent lighting seemed harsh and unforgiving, casting shadows that reminded him of interrogation rooms and military briefings where bad news was delivered with clinical detachment. Sarah Mitchell attempted another intervention, citing specific legal precedents for considering military service and documented disabilities during sentencing. Her research had uncovered multiple cases where veterans with similar conditions had received treatment programs rather than punitive measures, but Judge Hartwell dismissed each example with increasing irritation. The prosecutor, David Chen, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. While his job required him to seek appropriate consequences for criminal behavior, he'd never intended for the hearing to become a platform for attacking military service or mental health conditions. His own brother had served in the Navy and struggled with anxiety after deployment, giving Chen personal insight into the challenges facing returning veterans. Chen made a subtle attempt to redirect the proceeding toward more constructive outcomes, suggesting that Marcus's case might be better served through veteran treatment court or specialized programs designed for service members with PTSD. Judge Hartwell responded with barely concealed annoyance, making it clear that she viewed such alternatives as unnecessary coddling of individuals who should simply take responsibility for their actions. The tension in the courtroom had become palpable, with even court personnel exchanging concerned glances. Mrs. Barbara Collins, the court clerk, had worked in the legal system for over 2 decades and witnessed countless proceedings, but she'd never seen a judge display such open hostility toward a veteran's service-connected disabilities. Her own son was currently deployed overseas, and she couldn't help imagining him facing similar treatment if he came home carrying invisible wounds. Officer Kevin Walsh, the bailiff responsible for courtroom security, positioned himself strategically to monitor both the proceeding and the growing activity visible through the windows. His military experience had taught him to recognize building tension and prepare for multiple scenarios. The crowd outside remained peaceful and orderly, but their numbers continued to increase, creating a dynamic situation that required careful management. Sullivan's phone vibrated with a message from Captain Blake outside. "Ready when you are. Full complement assembled and maintaining discipline." Sullivan responded quickly. "Give me 2 minutes to assess the situation. Maintain current posture." He needed to time their entrance carefully, ensuring maximum impact while avoiding any appearance of intimidation or disruption of legal proceedings. Judge Hartwell was building toward her sentencing decision, her tone becoming more authoritative and final with each pronouncement. She'd clearly made up her mind about Marcus's fate, viewing his case as an opportunity to send a message about accountability and the limitations of mental health excuses. Her worldview didn't include space for the complex realities of combat trauma or the neurological basis of PTSD symptoms. Marcus felt his breathing becoming shallow and rapid, the early signs of a panic attack that threatened to overwhelm his remaining composure. The familiar copper taste filled his mouth as his nervous system prepared for fight or flight, the same response that had kept him alive in Afghanistan, but now marked him as unstable in civilian society. His vision began to tunnel, and the voices in the courtroom seemed to fade into background noise. In that moment of crisis, Marcus's mind drifted back to the morning when Morrison and Chen had died. He remembered their excitement about an upcoming patrol, their plans for leave when they returned to base, their photos of girlfriends and family members waiting at home. They'd trusted him to bring them back safely, and he'd failed them in the most fundamental way possible. Now their families would have to live with that loss forever, while he faced condemnation for the psychological scars their deaths had left on his soul. Sarah Mitchell noticed her client's deteriorating condition and leaned closer to offer support. She'd seen enough trauma cases to recognize the signs of an impending panic attack, and she knew that any visible breakdown would only reinforce Judge Hartwell's prejudices about veterans using mental health conditions as manipulation tactics. Mitchell placed a steadying hand on Marcus's arm and whispered reassurances, trying to keep him grounded in the present moment. Outside the courthouse, the final stragglers were arriving to join the assembly. Corporal Lisa Rodriguez had driven over from her job at a Veterans Outreach Center, bringing with her 3 other counselors who worked with combat veterans. They understood the systemic challenges facing service members seeking help and had witnessed too many cases where institutional ignorance had prevented access to appropriate care. The group now included representatives from multiple veteran service organizations, active duty personnel from several nearby military installations, and civilians whose family members had served. What had begun as an emergency response to support one Marine had evolved into a powerful demonstration of the veteran community's capacity for mobilization and mutual aid. Tank Williams adjusted his position in his wheelchair, the November wind cutting through his jacket and chilling the titanium prosthetics where his legs used to be. He'd lost his limbs to an IED explosion in the same province where Marcus had served, and he carried his own burden of survivor's guilt for the Marines who hadn't made it home. The physical scars were visible to everyone, but the psychological wounds remained hidden beneath the surface, requiring constant vigilance to prevent them from overwhelming his hard-won stability. Dr. Foster had reached the second floor and was making her way toward room 204 when she encountered several courthouse employees discussing the unusual gathering outside. Their conversation revealed growing concern about the situation's potential for escalation, despite the peaceful and disciplined behavior displayed by the assembled veterans. She introduced herself as a VA mental health professional and offered to serve as a liaison if needed, emphasizing the therapeutic importance of community support for individuals with combat-related PTSD. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hartwell was reaching her final decision. She'd reviewed Marcus's file one last time, focusing on the police reports and criminal charges, while giving minimal attention to the medical documentation and military service records. Her philosophy emphasized personal accountability and deterrent effect, viewing lenient sentences as enabling further criminal behavior rather than addressing underlying causes. The moment of truth was approaching, and Sullivan knew he had to act soon. He stood slowly from his seat in the gallery, his movement deliberate and respectful, but clearly purposeful. The time for passive observation had ended. His fellow Marine needed reinforcement, and the Brotherhood had answered the call. With quiet determination, he walked toward the courtroom doors, knowing that what happened next would either demonstrate the power of veteran solidarity or result in consequences that could affect them all. As his hand reached for the door handle, Sullivan thought about the countless Marines who'd made similar decisions to stand up for their comrades, often at great personal cost. The culture of leaving no one behind wasn't just a battlefield concept. It extended to every aspect of a Marine's life, including the civilian world, where invisible wounds could prove as deadly as enemy fire. Marcus Thompson would not face this injustice alone, not while Sullivan had breath in his body and brothers at his back. The courthouse had become a focal point for tensions that extended far beyond one veteran's legal troubles. Media crews were arriving as word spread through social networks and professional channels, their cameras capturing images of disciplined service members standing in solidarity with a fellow veteran. The visual impact was undeniable, row upon row of Marines, their bearing unmistakably military even in civilian clothes, their faces reflecting determination and unwavering loyalty. The crowd maintained perfect discipline, despite their growing numbers and emotional investment in the outcome. No one raised their voice or displayed aggression. Instead, they demonstrated the quiet professionalism that characterized military service at its best. Their presence spoke to values that transcended individual cases or personal grievances, representing a commitment to protecting those who'd already given so much in service to their country. Judge Hartwell, unaware of the gathering storm outside her courtroom, continued her monologue about responsibility and consequences. She'd built her judicial philosophy around the belief that consistent punishment deterred future criminal behavior, viewing mercy as weakness that encouraged further violations. Her experience had convinced her that defendants would exploit any excuse to avoid accountability, and she'd developed an efficient system for cutting through what she considered manipulative tactics. The irony was lost on her that the very institution she represented, the American justice system, existed because of sacrifices made by people like Marcus Thompson. The freedoms she exercised daily, including the authority to pass judgment on others, had been preserved through the blood and trauma of service members who'd faced unimaginable horrors to protect democratic values. Her dismissal of Marcus's condition represented not just personal prejudice, but institutional failure to honor the social contract between veterans and the society they'd served. Marcus felt the walls closing in as the hearing approached its conclusion. The combination of Judge Hartwell's hostility, the formal courtroom setting, and his own psychological fragility created a perfect storm of triggers that threatened to overwhelm his coping mechanisms. The breathing exercises Dr. Foster had taught him seemed inadequate against the tsunami of emotions and memories crashing over him. In his peripheral vision, he noticed movement in the gallery as Sullivan stood and began walking toward the exit. Something about his squad leader's posture and determination triggered a memory from Afghanistan, when Sullivan had made similar decisive movements in response to developing threats. Marcus couldn't hear what was happening outside the courtroom, but some instinct told him that the situation was about to change dramatically. Sarah Mitchell was making one final attempt to influence the judge's decision, citing Marcus's exemplary military record and the documented medical basis for his condition. She emphasized his commitment to treatment and his desire to contribute positively to society, arguing that punitive measures would undermine rather than support his recovery process. Her words carried the passion of someone who'd finally found a case worth fighting for, despite the apparent futility of reasoning with Judge Hartwell's prejudices. The prosecutor, David Chen, remained silent during this final exchange, his discomfort with the proceedings' direction evident in his body language and facial expressions. While his professional obligations required him to seek conviction, his personal ethics were troubled by the judge's treatment of a veteran's service-connected disabilities. The case had become something he'd never intended, a public attack on military service and mental health advocacy. Outside, Captain Blake received Sullivan's signal and began organizing the entrance. The assembled Marines formed into loose columns, their movement precise and coordinated despite the lack of explicit commands. They'd done this countless times in military settings, and the muscle memory of formation movement remained strong years after their active service had ended. The courthouse security guards watched nervously as the crowd began moving toward the entrance in an orderly but determined fashion. Radio calls went out to supervisors and additional personnel, though the peaceful nature of the assembly made it difficult to justify aggressive response measures. The situation required delicate handling to avoid escalating tensions while maintaining building security and judicial independence. Jennifer Hayes positioned her camera crew to capture the entrance, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in local courthouse history. The story had evolved beyond a simple misdemeanor case to become a powerful statement about veteran advocacy and community solidarity. Her live broadcast was already drawing attention from network affiliates and national news organizations. Dr. Foster reached the courtroom area just as the Marine formation approached the second floor. She recognized several faces from veteran community events and mental health conferences, understanding immediately that this represented a coordinated response to support Marcus. Her professional training had taught her about the therapeutic value of community support for trauma survivors, and she felt a surge of hope that Marcus might witness concrete evidence of his worth to fellow veterans. The moment had arrived. Sullivan pushed open the courtroom doors as Judge Hartwell began pronouncing sentence on Marcus Thompson, her words about to seal his fate as a criminal rather than recognizing him as a wounded warrior deserving support and understanding. Behind Sullivan, 50 Marines prepared to demonstrate that some bonds could never be broken and some disrespect would never be tolerated. The next few minutes would determine whether justice meant punishment or redemption, whether Marcus would face his challenges alone or surrounded by the brotherhood that had sustained him through combat and would carry him through this civilian battle. The courthouse was about to witness the power of military solidarity in action, a force that had toppled governments and defended democracy, now focused on protecting one Marine's dignity and future. The heavy oak doors of room 204 swung open with deliberate precision, creating a sound that cut through Judge Hartwell's sentencing speech like a blade through silence. Staff Sergeant Sullivan stepped across the threshold first, his bearing commanding immediate attention from everyone in the courtroom. His eyes swept the room with tactical awareness, taking in positions and assessing the situation with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile territory. Behind him, the entrance filled with a steady stream of Marines moving in perfect formation, despite the confined space and civilian setting. They entered two abreast, their footsteps synchronized in an unconscious rhythm that spoke to years of shared training and mutual trust. The sound of their movement echoed off the courtroom's high ceilings, creating an auditory backdrop that transformed the sterile legal environment into something approaching a military ceremony. Judge Hartwell's voice died mid-sentence as she witnessed the unprecedented sight unfolding before her bench. In 30 years of judicial service, she'd never seen anything remotely resembling this coordinated entrance of military personnel into her courtroom. Her first instinct was outrage at the interruption of official proceedings, but something about the disciplined nature of their movement gave her pause. The Marines filed into the gallery with practiced efficiency, filling every available seat and standing along the walls when the benches reached capacity. They moved without verbal commands, their coordination, the product of shared experience and mutual understanding rather than explicit direction. No one spoke above a whisper, and their bearing remained respectful, despite the powerful statement their presence made. Captain Blake entered wearing his dress blue uniform, the ribbons on his chest telling a story of deployments and combat service that commanded instant recognition from anyone familiar with military decorations. His presence lent official weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as an impromptu gathering. signaling that this response had institutional support, rather than representing rogue action by disgruntled individuals. Marcus felt his world shift as he recognized faces from his past and present converging in support of his struggle. There was Corporal Tony Ramirez, who'd shared a foxhole with him during their last patrol in Helmand Province. Lance Corporal Jake Anderson, who dragged wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire. Maria Santos, whose courage under pressure had earned her a Bronze Star and the respect of every Marine in their battalion. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For months, Marcus had felt isolated by his condition, viewing himself as damaged goods that society preferred to ignore or warehouse rather than heal. The sight of 50 Marines willing to risk their own standings to support his cause shattered that narrative of abandonment and worthlessness. Dr. Foster slipped into the courtroom as the formation completed its entrance, positioning herself where she could observe Marcus's reaction to this unexpected show of support. As his counselor, she understood the therapeutic significance of community validation for trauma survivors, especially those whose wounds had been inflicted in service to others. The Marine's presence represented tangible proof that his struggles were recognized and valued by people who truly understood their cost. Tank Williams maneuvered his wheelchair into position near the front of the gallery, his double amputation visible evidence of the sacrifices made by those who'd served in the same conflicts where Marcus had lost his psychological wholeness. The contrast between his obvious physical wounds and Marcus's invisible trauma highlighted the spectrum of injuries that could result from combat service, each requiring understanding and support rather than judgment and punishment. Judge Hartwell found her voice, though it carried less authority than before the Marine's entrance. "This is highly irregular. I don't know what you people think you're accomplishing, but this courtroom operates according to established procedures and legal precedent. You cannot simply march in here and disrupt official proceedings." Sullivan stepped forward slightly, his movement respectful but confident. "Your Honor, we're here as members of the public, observing a legal proceeding. We have every right to be present during open court sessions, and we've conducted ourselves within all applicable guidelines for courtroom behavior." The judge's eyes narrowed as she struggled to reassert control over a situation that had clearly moved beyond her expectations. While Sullivan was technically correct about public access to court proceedings, the coordinated nature of their entrance and the obvious message it sent challenged her authority in ways she'd never experienced. Sarah Mitchell felt a surge of hope as she witnessed the transformation in her client's posture and expression. Marcus had straightened in his chair, his breathing had steadied, and the pallor that had marked his face throughout the hearing was being replaced by something approaching strength. The presence of his fellow Marines had provided exactly the kind of support she'd been unable to offer through legal arguments alone. The prosecutor, David Chen, recognized that the dynamics of the case had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine misdemeanor prosecution was becoming a public statement about veteran treatment and institutional support. His own discomfort with Judge Hartwell's approach was now reflected in the presence of dozens of service members who deemed the proceeding important enough to interrupt their daily lives. Gunnery Sergeant Torres stood along the wall, his nonprofit organization's experience with veteran advocacy giving him insight into the broader implications of this moment. He'd seen too many cases where institutional indifference had destroyed lives that combat couldn't claim, and he understood that Marcus's situation represented a test case for how society would treat its wounded warriors. Master Sergeant Valdez positioned herself where Marcus could see her, knowing that her presence as a successful female Marine who'd overcome her own PTSD challenges might provide additional inspiration. She'd fought similar battles with civilian institutions that failed to understand the nature of combat trauma, and she'd learned to use the veteran community's solidarity as a source of strength rather than accepting isolation and shame. The courtroom's atmosphere had been completely transformed by the Marine's presence. What had been a sterile legal environment focused on punishment and deterrence had become something approaching a military formation, where loyalty and mutual support took precedence over individual concerns. The change was palpable. affecting everyone present regardless of their connection to military service. Jennifer Hayes captured the scene through her camera lens, recognizing that she was documenting a moment that would resonate far beyond Riverside County. The visual impact of 50 Marines standing in support of a fellow veteran facing institutional hostility created a powerful narrative about honor, sacrifice, and the obligations society owed to those who'd served. Judge Hartwell attempted to regain control of the proceeding, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. "Mr. Thompson, despite this theatrical display, the facts of your case remain unchanged. You committed acts of disorderly conduct that disrupted public order, and this court has an obligation to impose appropriate consequences regardless of your military service or claimed medical conditions." The word claimed landed like a physical blow, but this time Marcus didn't flinch. Surrounded by Marines who'd witnessed his service and understood his struggles, he found strength he'd forgotten he possessed. These men and women had faced enemy fire alongside him, had trusted him with their lives, and had deemed him worthy of their continued support despite his current challenges. Sullivan felt the temperature in the room shift as Judge Hartwell doubled down on her dismissive stance. He'd served under officers who displayed similar arrogance and institutional blindness, and he'd learned to recognize when diplomatic approaches would prove insufficient. The time for polite observation was ending. The moment for direct action had arrived. Corporal Ramirez caught Sullivan's eye and nodded slightly, their silent communication refined through years of dangerous situations, where verbal coordination could prove fatal. Around the courtroom, other Marines were making similar eye contact, confirming their readiness to escalate their response if the judge continued her assault on their fellow Marine's dignity. Dr. Foster observed the nonverbal communication flowing through the assembled Marines with professional fascination and personal concern. Their discipline remained absolute, but their emotional investment in Marcus's treatment was clearly intensifying. She understood the therapeutic value of their support, while recognizing the potential for confrontation if Judge Hartwell continued her provocative approach. The court clerk, Mrs. Collins, had stopped typing as she watched the unprecedented scene unfold before her. Her decades of experience in legal proceedings had provided no preparation for this level of coordinated community response to a judicial decision. The Marines' presence challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between military service and civilian authority. Officer Walsh, the bailiff, positioned himself strategically to monitor both the judge's security and the crowd's behavior. His own military background helped him read the assembled Marines' body language and recognize that while their discipline remained intact, their patience was being tested by the judge's continued disrespect toward their comrade. Captain Blake stepped forward, his dress blue uniform carrying the full weight of Marine Corps tradition and authority. "Your Honor, if I may address the court. These Marines have come here today not to disrupt your proceedings, but to demonstrate support for a fellow service member who has given much in defense of this nation's freedoms, including the freedom that allows this courtroom to operate." Judge Hartwell's response revealed the depth of her institutional arrogance and disconnect from military culture. "Captain, I don't care if he's a war hero or a Medal of Honor recipient. In my courtroom, everyone is equal under the law, and military service doesn't provide special privileges or excuses for criminal behavior." The silence that followed her words was profound and dangerous. 50 Marines absorbed the implications of a federal judge declaring that military service meant nothing in the face of civilian justice, that sacrifices made in defense of constitutional freedoms carried no weight in the very institutions those freedoms protected. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him as he witnessed Judge Hartwell's complete dismissal of everything he and his fellow Marines had endured. The woman sitting behind that bench, protected by the very freedoms they'd fought to preserve, was declaring their service meaningless in the face of a minor criminal charge triggered by combat-related trauma. The moment crystallized everything wrong with a system that sent young people to war and then abandoned them when they returned, carrying the psychological wounds of that service. Judge Hartwell represented every bureaucrat who'd treated veteran concerns as administrative inconveniences. every official who'd viewed PTSD as malingering, rather than recognizing it as a legitimate service-connected injury. Sullivan made his decision, knowing that the consequences could be severe but understanding that some principles were worth any personal cost. He began walking toward the front of the courtroom, his movement deliberate and purposeful. Behind him, other Marines began following, not in formation this time, but as individuals making personal choices to stand with their brother. The sound of their movement created a new rhythm in the courtroom, one that spoke to determination and unwavering loyalty, rather than legal procedure and institutional authority. They weren't marching to challenge civilian control of military forces or to disrupt constitutional government. They were walking to demonstrate that some bonds transcended legal jurisdiction and some respect could not be commanded through judicial decree. Tank Williams began wheeling his chair forward, the sound of his movement joining the chorus of footsteps as Marines throughout the gallery rose from their seats. Master Sergeant Valdez stepped away from the wall, her bearing confident and professional despite the unprecedented nature of their collective action. Dr. Foster watched with a mixture of professional concern and personal admiration as her patient found himself surrounded by living proof of his worth to the community that mattered most. The therapeutic value of this moment would take weeks to fully process, but she could already see its transformative impact on Marcus's self-perception and emotional stability. Judge Hartwell realized that her courtroom was experiencing something beyond her experience or training. The assembled Marines weren't threatening violence or disrupting proceedings through chaos. Instead, they were demonstrating a level of discipline and coordination that made their message more powerful than any verbal argument could have achieved. Sarah Mitchell felt tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed the most powerful defense of her client she'd ever seen. No legal brief or expert testimony could match the impact of 50 Marines willing to risk their own standings to support a fellow veteran facing institutional hostility. The case had transcended legal technicalities to become a statement about honor, loyalty, and the obligations society owed to its warriors. The Marines reached the front of the courtroom and formed a loose semicircle around Marcus's table, their presence creating a barrier between him and the judicial authority that had shown such contempt for his service and sacrifice. They stood at attention, not in challenge to civilian authority but in affirmation of military values that transcended legal jurisdiction. Marcus rose from his chair, no longer the isolated and broken veteran who'd entered the courtroom that morning. Surrounded by Marines who'd served alongside him and others who'd fought similar battles in different times and places, he found the strength to face Judge Hartwell with dignity intact and purpose restored. The courtroom had become a battleground where two fundamental worldviews confronted each other, one that viewed military service as irrelevant to civilian justice, and another that recognized the special obligations society owed to those who'd sacrificed health and wholeness in its defense. The outcome would determine not just Marcus's immediate fate, but the broader question of how America would treat its wounded warriors. Judge Hartwell faced a decision that would define her legacy and reveal the true nature of the justice she claimed to serve. She could continue her assault on military service and veteran dignity, or she could recognize that true justice required understanding the context of human behavior rather than applying punishment without wisdom. The assembled Marines waited with the patience of warriors who'd faced enemy fire and survived impossible odds. They'd made their statement through presence rather than protest, discipline rather than disruption. Now they would discover whether American justice could recognize the difference between criminal behavior and the inevitable consequences of service to country. The silence in room 204 stretched beyond comfort into something approaching reverence. 50 Marines stood in formation around Marcus Thompson, their collective presence transforming the sterile courtroom into something resembling a military ceremony. The weight of their shared service pressed against the institutional walls that had contained so many routine proceedings, challenging fundamental assumptions about justice, respect, and the obligations society owed its defenders. Judge Hartwell gripped her gavel with white knuckles, her authority challenged in ways she'd never experienced. The assembled Marines weren't shouting or making demands. Their silent discipline made their message more powerful than any verbal protest could have achieved. She found herself facing men and women who'd sworn the same oath she had taken as a federal judge, pledging to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Captain Blake stepped forward from the formation, his dress blue uniform carrying the full weight of Marine Corps tradition. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to address the court regarding Sergeant Thompson's character and service record. These Marines have come here today because they know something about this man that perhaps hasn't been adequately communicated to this court." The judge's instinct was to reject any interruption of her proceedings, but the unprecedented nature of the situation gave her pause. The media presence outside had grown substantially, and she was beginning to realize that her handling of this case would be scrutinized far beyond Riverside County. Nevertheless, her institutional pride and personal prejudices warred against any acknowledgement that she might have misjudged the situation. "I don't need a character reference from his military friends, Blake. This court operates based on facts and law, not sentiment and special pleading. Mr. Thompson committed specific acts that violated California statutes, and those violations carry prescribed penalties regardless of his employment history." Sullivan felt the collective tension of his fellow Marines at the judge's continued dismissal of their service. He'd served under officers who displayed similar arrogance, viewing enlisted personnel as expendable resources rather than human beings with intrinsic worth. But he'd also learned to recognize moments when direct confrontation would prove counterproductive, requiring instead the kind of strategic patience that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments. Marcus stood straighter as he felt the support of his brothers and sisters surrounding him. The familiar presence of Marines who'd shared foxholes and firefights provided anchor points against the psychological storm that had been battering him since the hearing began. Their willingness to risk their own standings for his cause reminded him that his worth wasn't measured by civilian institutions that failed to understand the cost of military service. Dr. Foster observed the transformation in her patient with professional fascination and personal relief. The isolated and defeated veteran who'd entered the courtroom was being replaced by someone who remembered his identity as a Marine and his connection to a community that valued honor above convenience. The therapeutic implications of this moment would resonate long after the legal proceedings concluded. Tank Williams positioned his wheelchair where Judge Hartwell couldn't avoid seeing the visible evidence of combat sacrifice. His missing legs told a story that complemented Marcus's invisible wounds, demonstrating the spectrum of injuries that could result from military service. The contrast between his obvious physical trauma and Marcus's hidden psychological damage highlighted the complexity of veteran health issues that couldn't be addressed through simplistic legal frameworks. The court reporter continued transcribing the proceedings with growing awareness that she was documenting something unprecedented in judicial history. Her stenographic machine captured words and actions that would likely be studied by legal scholars and military historians seeking to understand how civilian institutions had responded to veteran advocacy in the early 21st century. Sarah Mitchell felt a renewed sense of purpose as she witnessed the most powerful defense of her client she'd ever experienced. No legal precedent or expert testimony could match the impact of 50 Marines willing to interrupt their lives to support a fellow veteran facing institutional hostility. She began formulating arguments that could harness this demonstration of community support while maintaining proper legal procedure. Gunnery Sergeant Torres recognized the broader implications of this confrontation between veteran advocacy and judicial authority. His nonprofit organization had documented hundreds of cases where institutional ignorance had prevented veterans from accessing appropriate treatment and support services. Marcus's situation represented a test case for whether American institutions would honor their obligations to wounded warriors or continue treating them as administrative inconveniences. The prosecutor, David Chen, found himself questioning his role in a proceeding that had evolved far beyond routine criminal prosecution. His own family's military history made him uncomfortable with Judge Hartwell's dismissive treatment of veteran service, but his professional obligations required him to represent the state's interests regardless of personal feelings. Master Sergeant Valdez stepped forward from the formation, her ribbons and decorations telling their own story of combat service and leadership under fire. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to provide testimony about Sergeant Thompson's character and service record, not as a character witness, but as someone who served alongside him in Afghanistan and witnessed the circumstances that led to his current medical condition. Judge Hartwell's response revealed the depth of her disconnect from military culture and veteran issues. Sergeant, I appreciate your desire to help your friend, but this court isn't interested in war stories or testimonials about battlefield heroics. Mr. Thompson isn't being prosecuted for his military service. He's here because of specific criminal acts committed in civilian jurisdiction. The word criminal hung in the air like a physical presence, its implications clear to everyone present. Judge Hartwell had chosen to define Marcus by his worst moment, rather than considering the totality of his character and circumstances. Her institutional blindness prevented her from recognizing that the very symptoms she was criminalizing were direct consequences of his service to the nation she claimed to represent. Lance Corporal Anderson felt his jaw clench as he absorbed the judge's continued insults to Marine honor and sacrifice. The courtroom door opened once more, this time admitting a figure whose presence would fundamentally alter everything that had transpired. Colonel Helmand Rodriguez entered with the measured stride of a career officer, his silver hair and weathered face speaking to decades of military service that spanned multiple conflicts and countless leadership challenges. Unlike the assembled Marines who had come as advocates and supporters, Rodriguez carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. Rodriguez wore his dress blue uniform with ribbons that told a story of extraordinary service: Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, and decorations that marked him as a warrior who had not only survived combat, but excelled in the crucible of leadership under fire. His presence commanded immediate attention from everyone in the courtroom, including Judge Hartwell, who found herself facing military authority that rivaled her own judicial power. What made Rodriguez's entrance particularly significant was the leather portfolio he carried, containing documents that would prove crucial to Marcus's fate. As a practicing attorney who had transitioned to civilian law after retirement from active duty, he possessed both the military credibility to speak for Marcus and the legal standing to address the court on matters of law and procedure. Rodriguez approached the bar and spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Your Honor, I am Colonel Helmand Rodriguez, United States Marine Corps, retired, and a member of the California State Bar. I request permission to address this court regarding Sergeant Marcus Thompson, with whom I served in Afghanistan during Operation Enduring Freedom. Judge Hartwell found herself in an unprecedented situation. The assembled Marines had challenged her authority through their presence, but Rodriguez represented something different, a peer in terms of professional standing who could not be dismissed as easily as enlisted personnel or veterans struggling with civilian transition. His legal credentials demanded recognition, even if his military service did not. Colonel, this court has already heard extensive testimony about Mr. Thompson's military service. Unless you have new evidence directly relevant to the charges he faces, I see no need to prolong these proceedings with additional character testimony or battlefield reminiscences. Rodriguez opened his portfolio and withdrew a series of documents, his movements deliberate and professional. Your Honor, I have here official military records, medical evaluations, and incident reports that directly address the circumstances surrounding Sergeant Thompson's current medical condition. These documents were not previously available to the court because they were classified until recently declassified through my efforts and those of Congressman Mitchell's office. The mention of congressional involvement caused visible discomfort among court personnel. Judge Hartwell prided herself on maintaining judicial independence from political pressure, but the implication that her handling of this case had attracted attention from federal legislators suggested consequences that extended far beyond her courtroom. Sarah Mitchell felt a surge of hope as she realized that powerful allies were mobilizing on Marcus's behalf. The classified nature of the documents Rodriguez had obtained suggested that Marcus's service had involved operations more significant than routine patrol duties, potentially providing context that could transform the court's understanding of his condition. Marcus himself remained focused on Rodriguez's familiar face, memories flooding back of the officer who had been present during some of the darkest moments of their deployment. Rodriguez had been there when the medevac helicopters arrived to transport Morrison and Chen's remains, had spoken at their memorial service, and had personally ensured that surviving squad members received appropriate recognition for their actions that day. Dr. Foster observed the dynamic shift in courtroom atmosphere as Rodriguez established his credentials and authority. The therapeutic principle of external validation was being demonstrated in real time as Marcus witnessed respected figures from his past stepping forward to advocate for his worth and dignity. The psychological impact would be profound and lasting. Rodriguez began presenting evidence that painted a dramatically different picture of Marcus's service than what had been previously available to the court. The first document detailed Operation Resolute Guardian, a classified mission in which Marcus's squad had been tasked with protecting a forward operating base against sustained enemy assault, while evacuation procedures were implemented for wounded Afghan civilians. Your Honor, Sergeant Thompson and his squad maintained defensive positions for 18 hours under continuous enemy fire, allowing the successful evacuation of 47 civilian casualties, including 16 children. His leadership during this engagement was instrumental in preventing what intelligence estimates suggested would have been a massacre of innocent civilians. The courtroom listened in silence as Rodriguez continued reading from official reports that detailed Marcus's extraordinary courage and tactical skill under extreme pressure. These weren't the generic commendations that might be awarded for routine service. They documented specific acts of heroism that had saved lives at great personal risk. The second document addressed the IED incident that had claimed Morrison and Chen's lives, providing details that had been omitted from previous accounts due to operational security concerns. Rodriguez explained that Marcus's squad had been conducting a reconnaissance mission to identify weapons caches used by insurgent forces targeting civilian populations in the region. The explosive device that killed Private First Class Morrison and Lance Corporal Chen was not a random attack, but a deliberately targeted ambush by enemy forces who had been tracking the squad's movements for several days. Sergeant Thompson's decision to remain exposed while providing covering fire for his wounded comrades prevented additional casualties, but resulted in his own exposure to secondary explosions and sustained psychological trauma. Tank Williams listened with recognition and pain as Rodriguez described combat scenarios that paralleled his own experiences in the same theater. The clinical language of official reports could never capture the full horror of watching fellow Marines die in circumstances beyond anyone's control, but it provided legal framework for understanding the origins of combat-related PTSD. Judge Hartwell found herself confronting information that challenged her preconceptions about military service and veteran issues. The documents Rodriguez presented weren't emotional appeals or subjective character testimony. They were official records that documented extraordinary service under conditions most civilians could never imagine. The third document proved most significant: a medical evaluation conducted immediately after the IED incident by a Navy psychiatrist attached to the forward operating base. The report detailed acute stress reactions observed in Marcus during the 24 hours following the explosion, including dissociation, hypervigilance, and intrusive memories that would later develop into full-blown PTSD. Colonel Rodriguez looked directly at Judge Hartwell as he read from the psychiatric evaluation. The examining physician noted that Sergeant Thompson displayed symptoms consistent with acute stress disorder following exposure to life-threatening trauma and the loss of personnel under his command. The report specifically recommended immediate evacuation for specialized treatment, but Sergeant Thompson refused medical evacuation and remained with his unit for the final 6 weeks of their deployment. This revelation demonstrated the depth of Marcus's commitment to his fellow Marines and his willingness to sacrifice his own mental health to avoid abandoning his responsibilities. Rather than seeking the earliest possible escape from combat conditions, he had chosen to remain in an environment that was actively damaging his psychological well-being because his squad needed experienced leadership. Sullivan felt a surge of pride mixed with sorrow as he remembered Marcus's refusal to leave Afghanistan, while other squad members remained in danger. At the time, they had all respected his decision to stay and finish the deployment, but none of them had fully understood the personal cost he was paying to maintain unit cohesion and morale. Rodriguez presented additional evidence showing that Marcus's PTSD symptoms had been documented by multiple medical professionals throughout his military career and continuing into his veteran status. The progression from acute stress reaction to chronic PTSD was clearly documented, with specific attention to auditory triggers related to explosive sounds and emergency vehicle sirens. Your Honor, the medical evidence clearly establishes that Sergeant Thompson's reaction during the traffic stop was not a willful act of defiance, but an involuntary neurological response to auditory triggers directly connected to his combat trauma. His condition is not only documented but service-connected, meaning it was caused by his military service and is recognized by the Department of Veterans Affairs as a legitimate disability. The legal implications were clear. Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop could not be properly evaluated without understanding the medical context of his condition. Judge Hartwell was being confronted with evidence that her dismissive attitude toward PTSD was not only morally questionable, but potentially legally indefensible. Captain Blake stepped forward to add his own testimony to Rodriguez's presentation. Your Honor, I have served with hundreds of Marines over 2 decades of active duty, and I can state without qualification that Sergeant Thompson represents the finest traditions of our Corps. His willingness to sacrifice his own well-being for his fellow Marines exemplifies the values we strive to instill in every service member. The assembled Marines listened as their officers provided testimony that validated their own understanding of Marcus's character and service. These weren't emotional appeals based on friendship or sympathy. They were professional evaluations from experienced leaders who understood the demands of combat leadership and the costs of making life-and-death decisions in hostile environments. Master Sergeant Valdez was granted permission to address the court, her own decorations lending credibility to her testimony about the realities of combat trauma and recovery. Your Honor, as someone who has experienced combat-related PTSD and successfully integrated back into civilian society, I can attest that Sergeant Thompson's condition is both real and treatable. With appropriate support and understanding, veterans with similar conditions can become productive members of society rather than burdens on the criminal justice system. Her words carried particular weight because they came from someone who had walked the same path Marcus was traveling. Valdez had faced her own struggles with trauma-related symptoms and had found ways to channel her military experience into positive civilian contributions through veteran advocacy and mentorship programs. Dr. Foster was permitted to provide professional testimony about Marcus's treatment progress and prognosis for continued recovery. Her clinical evaluation painted a picture of someone actively engaged in addressing his condition rather than using it as an excuse for irresponsible behavior. Marcus had attended every scheduled appointment, complied with medication protocols, and demonstrated genuine commitment to managing his symptoms. Your Honor, in my professional opinion, Sergeant Thompson represents a success story in veteran mental health treatment. His engagement with therapy, his compliance with treatment recommendations, and his progress in developing coping strategies demonstrate that he poses no ongoing threat to public safety. Criminal prosecution would likely undermine his recovery progress and serve no legitimate public interest. The prosecutor, David Chen, found himself in an increasingly difficult position as evidence mounted that contradicted the simple narrative of criminal behavior requiring punishment. His own professional ethics were troubled by proceeding with prosecution against someone whose alleged crimes were directly connected to service-connected disabilities, especially given the overwhelming evidence of Marcus's character and commitment to treatment. Judge Hartwell reviewed the documents Rodriguez had presented, her legal training warring with her personal prejudices about veteran issues. The evidence was compelling and officially documented, making it difficult to dismiss as emotional manipulation or excuse-making. She faced a choice between maintaining her position despite contradictory evidence or acknowledging that she had misjudged both Marcus's character and the nature of his condition. The courtroom waited in tense silence as Judge Hartwell considered her response to this new information. The assembled Marines maintained their disciplined bearing, but their emotional investment in the outcome was evident in their focused attention on every word and gesture from the bench. Rodriguez sensed the pivotal nature of the moment and made one final appeal that connected Marcus's individual case to broader questions of justice and societal obligation. Your Honor, this case represents more than one veteran's legal troubles. It symbolizes how our society chooses to treat those who have sacrificed their health and well-being in defense of our freedoms. The decision you make today will be remembered not just by these Marines, but by every veteran watching to see whether civilian institutions will honor their service or abandon them when they need support most. The weight of Rodriguez's words settled over the courtroom like a blanket, emphasizing the broader implications of Judge Hartwell's decision. This wasn't just about Marcus Thompson anymore. It had become a test case for how American justice would treat its wounded warriors in an era when understanding of combat trauma was evolving rapidly. Marcus stood surrounded by Marines who had traveled hundreds of miles to demonstrate their faith in his character and worth. The contrast between his isolation at the beginning of the hearing and his current support network illustrated the power of community solidarity in healing both individual trauma and societal wounds. The moment of decision had arrived. Judge Hartwell could continue down the path of punishment and dismissal that had characterized her approach throughout the hearing, or she could demonstrate that American justice was capable of wisdom, mercy, and recognition of extraordinary circumstances. The entire courtroom held its breath as she prepared to render judgment that would determine not only Marcus's immediate fate, but the broader question of how society would treat its most vulnerable heroes. Tank Williams adjusted his position in his wheelchair, the sound of metal against wood, serving as a reminder that some sacrifices were visible while others remained hidden beneath the surface. His presence, along with that of every other Marine in the courtroom, represented a commitment to leaving no one behind that extended far beyond battlefield situations. The silence stretched beyond comfort into something approaching sacred space, where fundamental questions about honor, sacrifice, and justice would be answered through the words of a single judge whose decision would resonate far beyond the confines of room 204. The assembled Marines waited with the patience of warriors who had faced impossible odds and survived, their faith in Marcus unshaken regardless of the institutional verdict about to be rendered. Judge Patricia Hartwell set down the classified documents with hands that trembled, almost imperceptibly, the weight of revelations settling over her like storm clouds gathering strength. For 30 years, she had prided herself on making decisions based on law and precedent, viewing emotion and circumstance as obstacles to clear-eyed justice. Now she faced evidence that challenged not only her understanding of this specific case, but her fundamental assumptions about military service and the invisible wounds it could inflict. The courtroom remained suspended in anticipation as Hartwell removed her reading glasses and massaged the bridge of her nose, a gesture that revealed the strain of confronting information that demanded a complete reevaluation of everything that had transpired. The classified documents detailed heroism under fire, leadership in impossible circumstances, and sacrifice that extended far beyond the call of duty. Marcus Thompson was not the troubled veteran seeking special treatment that she had imagined. He was a decorated Marine whose current struggles were direct consequences of extraordinary service to his country. The transformation in Judge Hartwell's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to read the signs of institutional authority under pressure. Her rigid posture softened slightly, and the edge of contempt that had characterized her earlier pronouncements gave way to something approaching uncertainty. She had built her judicial philosophy around personal accountability and individual responsibility, but the evidence before her suggested that some wounds transcended personal choice and entered the realm of collective obligation. Colonel Rodriguez maintained his position at the podium, recognizing that this moment required patient silence rather than additional argument. He had presented facts that spoke for themselves, documented heroism that needed no embellishment, and medical evidence that established clear connections between military service and current symptoms. The next move belonged to the court, and rushing to fill silence might diminish the impact of revelations that were already reshaping the proceedings' trajectory. Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside him as he watched Judge Hartwell grapple with evidence of his true character and service record. For months, he had internalized society's apparent indifference to veteran struggles, viewing himself as damaged goods that civilian institutions preferred to ignore, or warehouse, rather than heal. The classified documents represented official validation of his worth and sacrifice, proof that his suffering had meaning and his service had mattered. The assembled Marines witnessed their judge wrestling with preconceptions that had shaped her career and worldview. Some felt satisfaction at seeing authority figures confronted with their own ignorance, while others experienced empathy for someone forced to acknowledge the limitations of their understanding. All recognized that this moment would determine whether institutional justice could evolve to accommodate new knowledge about military service and its consequences. Dr. Foster observed the psychological transformation occurring in her patient as external validation reinforced the therapeutic work they had been conducting together. Marcus's posture had straightened, his breathing had stabilized, and the haunted expression that had marked his features throughout the hearing was being replaced by something approaching dignity restored. The power of community support and official recognition was demonstrating its healing potential in real time. Sarah Mitchell felt cautious optimism as she witnessed the most dramatic reversal of judicial momentum she had experienced in her legal career. The classified documents had provided exactly the kind of compelling evidence that could justify a complete reconsideration of charges and sentencing recommendations. Her client was being revealed as someone deserving protection and support, rather than punishment and deterrence. Staff Sergeant Sullivan maintained his position in the formation of Marines surrounding Marcus, but his attention was focused entirely on Judge Hartwell's struggle with new information. He had served under officers who displayed similar institutional blindness, and he understood that some authority figures could adapt their positions when confronted with contradictory evidence, while others would double down on their original judgments regardless of new facts. The prosecutor, David Chen, recognized that his case was crumbling as evidence mounted that contradicted the simple narrative of criminal behavior requiring punishment. His professional obligations required him to represent the state's interests, but those interests were presumably served by justice rather than misguided prosecution of someone whose alleged crimes were manifestations of service-connected disabilities. Tank Williams observed Judge Hartwell's internal struggle with the patience of someone who had faced his own institutional battles over veteran benefits and disability recognition. His visible wounds had provided immediate credibility that Marcus's invisible trauma had initially lacked, but the classified documents were bridging that gap by providing official documentation of sacrifice and heroism that civilian institutions could understand and respect. Captain Blake stood ready to provide additional testimony if requested, his dress blue uniform serving as a visual reminder of military tradition and values that extended far beyond individual cases or legal technicalities. The Marine Corps had invested decades in developing Marcus's leadership skills and tactical expertise, and that investment deserved recognition rather than dismissal when evaluating his current circumstances. Master Sergeant Valdez positioned herself where Marcus could see her, knowing that her presence as a successful female Marine who had overcome similar challenges provided proof that recovery and productive civilian life were possible with appropriate support and understanding. Her own struggles with PTSD had taught her the importance of community solidarity and institutional recognition in the healing process. The court reporter continued documenting proceedings with growing awareness that she was recording a historic moment in the relationship between civilian justice and military service. Her stenographic machine captured words and actions that would likely be studied by legal scholars and military historians, seeking to understand how institutional attitudes toward veteran issues had evolved in the early 21st century. Gunnery Sergeant Torres felt vindication for the advocacy work his nonprofit organization had been conducting on behalf of veterans facing similar institutional challenges. Marcus's case represented the kind of systemic problem they encountered regularly: civilian institutions applying inappropriate standards to situations that required understanding of military culture and combat trauma. Jennifer Hayes continued filming the proceedings, with recognition that she was documenting something unprecedented in local courthouse history. The story had evolved far beyond a routine misdemeanor case to become a powerful statement about veteran advocacy, community solidarity, and the evolution of institutional understanding regarding military service and its consequences. Judge Hartwell finally spoke, her voice carrying less authority than before, but more wisdom than she had demonstrated throughout the earlier proceeding. Colonel Rodriguez, these documents present information that was not available to this court during previous testimony. The classified nature of Sergeant Thompson's service record obviously prevented his counsel from providing complete context for his current medical condition and the circumstances surrounding the incident in question. The acknowledgment represented a significant shift in judicial tone, moving from dismissive hostility toward recognition that incomplete information might have shaped earlier judgments. Rodriguez nodded respectfully, understanding that institutional authority required face-saving mechanisms even when acknowledging error or incomplete understanding. Your Honor, the classification of these documents was recently lifted specifically to ensure that Sergeant Thompson and other veterans with similar service records could receive appropriate consideration from civilian institutions. The Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs have recognized that national security concerns should not prevent proper evaluation of service-connected disabilities in legal proceedings. This explanation provided Judge Hartwell with additional context for understanding how military bureaucracy could create situations where relevant information remained hidden from civilian authorities who needed it to make informed decisions. The intersection of national security and individual justice created complex challenges that required coordination between military and civilian institutions. Marcus listened as the conversation around him evolved from criminal prosecution toward recognition of his service and sacrifice. The transformation was so complete that he struggled to reconcile the current proceeding with the hostile environment he had experienced earlier. The presence of his fellow Marines had catalyzed changes that individual legal argument could never have achieved. Dr. Foster prepared to provide additional testimony about Marcus's treatment progress and prognosis for continued recovery, recognizing that the court's new understanding of his service record created opportunities for therapeutic rather than punitive responses to his current situation. The medical evidence was clear. Appropriate support and understanding were more likely to promote public safety than criminal prosecution and incarceration. The assembled Marines maintained their disciplined bearing while witnessing the institutional transformation occurring before them. Their collective presence had demanded respect for military service and veteran sacrifice, but the classified documents had provided factual foundation for that respect, rather than relying solely on emotional appeal or community pressure. Judge Hartwell continued reviewing the evidence with visible attention to details she had previously dismissed or overlooked. The medical evaluations documented clear progression from acute stress reaction to chronic PTSD, with specific identification of auditory triggers that directly explained Marcus's behavior during the traffic stop. The connection between military service and current symptoms was medically and legally documented. Colonel Rodriguez sensed the moment was appropriate for addressing broader implications beyond Marcus's individual case. Your Honor, this situation illustrates the importance of ensuring that civilian institutions have access to complete information about military service when evaluating veteran-related cases. Many service members have similar classified service records that could provide crucial context for understanding their current circumstances and treatment needs. The suggestion that this case might represent a broader systemic issue carried implications that extended far beyond Room 204. If other veterans were facing similar challenges due to classified service records preventing complete evaluation of their cases, then institutional procedures might require modification to ensure appropriate consideration of military service and its consequences. Sarah Mitchell recognized an opportunity to propose specific remedies that could address both Marcus's immediate situation and the broader institutional challenges identified through this proceeding. Your Honor, given the new evidence regarding my client's extraordinary military service and the documented medical basis for his condition, I respectfully request that this court consider alternatives to criminal prosecution that would better serve both public safety and my client's continued recovery. The request for alternative sentencing opened pathways toward therapeutic rather than punitive responses that could acknowledge Marcus's service while addressing legitimate public safety concerns. Veteran treatment courts and specialized programs had demonstrated success in addressing underlying issues rather than simply punishing symptoms of service-connected conditions. Judge Hartwell faced a decision that would define not only Marcus's immediate fate, but her own legacy as a jurist, capable of wisdom and adaptation when confronted with new evidence. The assembled Marines waited with the patience of warriors who had faced impossible odds and survived, their faith in Marcus unshaken, regardless of the institutional verdict about to be rendered. The transformation in courtroom atmosphere was complete, moving from hostile prosecution toward collaborative problem-solving that recognized the complex intersection of military service, medical conditions, and civilian justice. What had begun as routine criminal proceeding had evolved into something approaching restorative justice, focused on healing rather than punishment. Marcus stood surrounded by evidence of his worth and dignity, supported by Marines who had traveled hundreds of miles to demonstrate their faith in his character. The contrast between his isolation at the hearing's beginning and his current validation illustrated the power of community solidarity in healing both individual trauma and societal wounds. Judge Patricia Hartwell rose from her bench with deliberate slowness, the weight of revelation settling into her bones like winter cold. The classified documents lay before her like accusations against everything she had believed about justice, accountability, and the nature of human behavior under extraordinary circumstances. For 30 years she had viewed the law as a rigid framework that treated all citizens equally, but Marcus Thompson's case had revealed the inadequacy of that framework when applied to those who had sacrificed their psychological wholeness in service to their country. The silence in room 204 carried a different quality now, pregnant with possibility rather than laden with dread. The assembled Marines maintained their formation around Marcus, but their bearing had shifted from defensive solidarity to expectant hope. They had witnessed institutional authority confronting its own limitations, and they waited to see whether wisdom would triumph over pride in the crucible of judicial decision-making. I have presided over thousands of cases during my tenure on this bench, Judge Hartwell began, her voice carrying new weight and consideration. I have always believed that consistent application of legal standards, regardless of personal circumstances, represented the highest form of justice. Today, however, I have been confronted with evidence that challenges not only my understanding of this specific case, but my assumptions about the nature of service, sacrifice, and the obligations we owe to those who have defended our freedoms. The words carried across the courtroom like ripples in still water, touching everyone present with their implications. Marcus felt something fundamental shifting inside him as he heard institutional authority acknowledging the reality of his service and struggle. The validation came not from sympathy or political correctness, but from factual evidence that his sacrifices had been real, documented, and worthy of respect. Colonel Rodriguez maintained his position at the podium, recognizing that this moment required restraint rather than advocacy. He had presented the facts that spoke for themselves, and now the judicial system would reveal whether it possessed the wisdom and flexibility to adapt when confronted with new understanding. The military had taught him patience in the face of bureaucratic processes, and that training served him well as institutional authority grappled with paradigm shift. Dr. Foster observed the transformation occurring in her patient as external validation reinforced months of therapeutic work aimed at rebuilding his sense of self-worth. Marcus's posture had straightened progressively throughout the hearing as evidence mounted of his character and service, but Judge Hartwell's acknowledgement represented something qualitatively different, official recognition from the civilian institution that had initially dismissed his struggles. The documents presented by Colonel Rodriguez, Judge Hartwell continued, establish beyond question that Sergeant Thompson's military service was extraordinary by any standard. His actions in Afghanistan saved dozens of lives, both military and civilian, often at great personal risk. The psychological injuries he sustained during that service are as real and as deserving of our respect as any physical wound received in combat. Sarah Mitchell felt tears forming in her eyes as she witnessed the most complete vindication of a client she had ever experienced. The transformation from criminal defendant to recognized hero had occurred not through legal maneuvering, but through revelation of truth that had been hidden by classification requirements and institutional ignorance. Justice was finally being served, not through punishment but through understanding. Tank Williams adjusted his position in his wheelchair, the sound of metal against wood, serving as physical reminder of sacrifices that extended far beyond individual cases. His presence, along with that of every other Marine in the courtroom, had helped create space for truth to emerge and institutional wisdom to prevail over prejudice and ignorance. Furthermore, Judge Hartwell continued, the medical evidence clearly establishes that Sergeant Thompson's behavior during the incident in question was not willful criminal conduct, but an involuntary neurological response to triggers directly connected to his combat trauma. To proceed with criminal prosecution under these circumstances would not serve justice, but would instead represent a fundamental failure of our legal system to protect those who have already given so much in our defense. The words fell like benediction over the assembled Marines, validation of everything they had believed about their brother's character and circumstances. Their collective presence had created the pressure necessary for truth to emerge, but the classified documents had provided the factual foundation that institutional authority required to change course. Staff Sergeant Sullivan felt vindication for his decision to mobilize the veteran community in support of Marcus. The risk had been substantial. Their coordinated response could have been dismissed as intimidation or interference with judicial proceedings. Instead, their discipline and bearing had demonstrated military values while creating space for crucial information to be presented and considered. Master Sergeant Valdez recognized that this moment represented more than individual vindication. It symbolized potential transformation in how civilian institutions understood and responded to veteran issues. Her own struggles with PTSD had taught her that institutional recognition and community support were essential elements in healing trauma that extended far beyond individual therapy and medication. Gunnery Sergeant Torres saw validation for the advocacy work his nonprofit organization had been conducting on behalf of veterans facing similar institutional challenges. Marcus's case would become a precedent for addressing the intersection of military service, combat trauma, and civilian justice, potentially benefiting thousands of other veterans who needed understanding rather than punishment. Therefore, Judge Hartwell announced, her voice carrying newfound authority, born of wisdom rather than power, this court hereby dismisses all charges against Sergeant Marcus Thompson. Furthermore, I am directing the court to expunge all records of these proceedings from Sergeant Thompson's criminal history, ensuring that this case will not appear on background checks or employment screenings that might affect his ability to rebuild his civilian life. The courtroom erupted in restrained celebration as Marines throughout the gallery exchanged glances of satisfaction and relief. Their discipline prevented any outward display of emotion, but their joy was evident in subtle smiles and slight relaxation of military bearing. They had witnessed institutional justice rise to meet the challenge of extraordinary circumstances. Marcus felt the weight of months of anxiety and fear lifting from his shoulders, like physical burden being removed. The criminal charges that had threatened to destroy his employment prospects and mark him permanently as a criminal were disappearing, replaced by official recognition of his service and understanding of his condition. The transformation was so complete that he struggled to process its magnitude. But Judge Hartwell was not finished. Additionally, I am recommending that Sergeant Thompson be connected with specialized veteran services that can provide ongoing support for his recovery and transition to civilian life. This court recognizes that punishment is inappropriate when healing and support are what justice truly demands. Dr. Foster felt professional satisfaction at hearing institutional authority explicitly acknowledge the therapeutic rather than punitive approach that Marcus's condition required. The recommendation for specialized services demonstrated understanding that combat trauma required ongoing support rather than one-time intervention. Captain Blake stepped forward from the formation of Marines, his dress blue uniform carrying the full weight of institutional gratitude. Your Honor, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and every service member present, I want to express our appreciation for your wisdom and courage in recognizing the truth about Sergeant Thompson's character and service. This decision honors not only him but every veteran who has struggled with the invisible wounds of war. The formal acknowledgement created a bridge between military and civilian institutions, demonstrating that cooperation and understanding were possible when truth was allowed to emerge. Judge Hartwell nodded respectfully, recognizing that her decision had implications extending far beyond one veteran's case. Colonel Rodriguez approached the bench with additional documents that would cement Marcus's transformation from criminal defendant to honored veteran. Your Honor, I have here official paperwork recommending Sergeant Thompson for delayed recognition of his combat service, including medals that were not awarded at the time due to the classified nature of his operations. With your permission, I would like to present these recommendations to ensure he receives full recognition for his sacrifices. The prospect of delayed military honors added another layer of vindication to proceedings that had already transformed Marcus's legal status and public standing. Judge Hartwell granted permission for the presentation, recognizing that her courtroom had become a venue for restoring honor that had been delayed by bureaucratic necessity. As Rodriguez read the citations for valor and leadership under fire, Marcus was transported back to Afghanistan and the faces of Marines who had trusted him with their lives. Morrison and Chen were no longer sources of guilt and shame, but reminders of relationships that had demanded his best efforts and received them. Their deaths had meaning because his leadership had saved others, and their memory could finally be honored rather than mourned. The assembled Marines listened as official recognition was restored to their brother, validating their own understanding of his character and worth. The coordinates' response that had brought them to this courtroom was being vindicated not just through legal victory, but through institutional acknowledgement of military values and sacrifice. Dr. Foster understood that this moment represented a crucial turning point in Marcus's psychological recovery. The combination of legal vindication, community support, and official recognition created a foundation for healing that individual therapy alone could never have achieved. The trauma would remain, but it would be contextualized within a framework of honor rather than shame. Judge Hartwell made one final statement that would resonate far beyond Room 204. This case has taught me that true justice requires not just application of law, but understanding of context, compassion for those who have served our nation, and willingness to adapt when new information challenges our assumptions. I hope that other judicial officers will learn from this experience and approach veteran cases with the wisdom and respect they deserve. The words carried implications for institutional change that could affect thousands of veterans facing similar challenges throughout the civilian justice system. Marcus's case had become a teaching moment that could prevent other heroes from facing the kind of institutional hostility and ignorance that had initially characterized his treatment. Sarah Mitchell approached her client with tears of joy and professional satisfaction. Marcus, you're free, not just from these charges, but from the shadow they would have cast over your future. You can rebuild your life knowing that your service has been recognized and your sacrifice honored. Marcus looked around the courtroom at faces that had been transformed from hostile strangers to respectful citizens. The Marines who had traveled hundreds of miles to support him were preparing to return to their own lives with the satisfaction of mission accomplished. Judge Hartwell was gathering the documents that had revealed truth hidden by classification and institutional ignorance. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Hayes was already broadcasting the story that would resonate throughout the veteran community and beyond. The image of 50 Marines standing in solidarity with a fellow veteran, combined with dramatic courtroom vindication, created a narrative of honor and redemption that spoke to fundamental American values about service and sacrifice. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus remained surrounded by Marines who had become his brothers, not just in service but in civilian struggle and triumph. Their presence had made possible a transformation that legal argument alone could never have achieved, demonstrating the power of community solidarity in healing both individual trauma and societal wounds. Tank Williams wheeled his chair toward Marcus, extending a hand that carried the weight of shared experience and mutual respect. "Welcome back, Marine. You're home now, not just from Afghanistan but from the wilderness, where wounded warriors sometimes get lost. The Brotherhood brought you back, and the Brotherhood will keep you strong." The words carried profound truth about community support and mutual obligation that extended far beyond individual cases or legal proceedings. Marcus had been restored not just to legal standing but to his place within a community that valued honor above convenience and loyalty above comfort. Colonel Rodriguez gathered his documents with satisfaction of mission accomplished. The classified records had served their purpose, revealing truth that institutional ignorance had obscured. Marcus would receive not only legal vindication, but military recognition that had been delayed by operational security requirements. As the Marines filed out of the courtroom in the same disciplined formation that had marked their entrance, they carried with them proof that institutional justice could evolve when confronted with truth and courage. Their coordinated response had created space for wisdom to prevail over prejudice, demonstrating that military values of loyalty and mutual support remained relevant in civilian society. Judge Hartwell remained at her bench, reviewing documents that had taught her more about justice, service, and human resilience than 30 years of routine proceedings. The transformation she had witnessed in Marcus Thompson paralleled her own evolution, from rigid adherence to rules toward wisdom that recognized the complex humanity of those who appeared before her court. Dr. Foster prepared to continue therapeutic work with Marcus from a foundation of strength rather than shame. The institutional validation and community support he had received would accelerate healing processes that might otherwise have required years to achieve. The invisible wounds of war could be healed when society provided appropriate understanding and respect. The story that had begun with institutional hostility and veteran isolation had transformed into something approaching sacred narrative about honor, sacrifice, and redemption. Marcus Thompson had entered room 204 as a criminal defendant, facing punishment for service-connected disabilities. He was leaving as a recognized hero whose struggles had revealed institutional wisdom and community strength. The 50 Marines who had answered Sullivan's call were returning to their own lives, with renewed faith in the values that had sustained them through military service and civilian challenges. They had demonstrated that leaving no one behind extended far beyond battlefield situations, encompassing the ongoing obligation to protect fellow veterans facing institutional hostility and societal indifference. The courthouse steps that had witnessed unprecedented gathering of military solidarity were emptying, as Marines departed with mission accomplished and brotherhood preserved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.